theorist and scholar Peter Rabinowitz, in which he introduces this idea of the authorial reader. I realized that this reading is challenging, and so I wanted to put together a guide to sort of aid your understanding, and also as a way sort of to check to make sure that you are understanding it. This is particularly for my fifth period who have kind of cast adrift as I've had to leave to do some emergency subbing in the School of Theater. So I wanted to put this together. So let's talk about and review what Rabinowitz's ideas are around these sort of twin ideas of the authorial and actual readers. And you should know that Rabinowitz is one of many scholars on the topic of reading theory and reader response criticism and sort of offshoot of hermeneutics. Just again, know that he's not the last or even first word on the topic, but he brings up a concept that I think is interesting for us, and we do sort of think about, we just maybe not in the terms he uses. So let's talk about this authorial reader concept. So this is the reader whom the author imagined would read their book. As the author wrote, they assumed that there were readers who share their worldview and social assumptions. And lastly, authorial readers have, in theory, an easier time accessing a text because they share the worldview of the author. So let's go through each of these definitions. So the first one says, this is the authorial reader. This is the reader whom the author imagined would read their book. And it's called the authorial reader because it was the one the author imagined, right? So an author writes a book, and every author who writes has an imagined audience. That person, that sort of average Joe, who would pick up their book, right? And that sort of reader that they imagine could be defined by nationality, race, gender, region of a particular country. For example, in the United States, there's Southern fiction, there's Western fiction. So there are many different factors that can go into whom an author had imagined their reader would be. All right, but an authorial reader is that reader whom the author was sort of writing for in their heads. Right now, when an author writes a text, they make some assumptions that you know things. Right, so often those assumptions are cultural. Right. For example, an author in this country assumes that you read from left to right. All right. An author assumes that when they write a text that you can read it all, right? That's not so much a cultural assumption, but again, most of the assumptions when it comes to being an authorial reader are cultural in nature. But when an author writes, they assume that you have an understanding of the culture in which they're writing, right? Sometimes, for example, that's why when you read texts by non-American writers or non-English speaking writers or non-Western writers, it can be more challenging to comprehend simply because there isn't a cultural context, right? And then lastly, authorial readers have, in theory, an easier time accessing a text. So if you read a text by an author who had you in mind, of course it's probably going to be easier to access. One of the problems that students encounter, for example, like in Rabinowitz's text, right? You probably had a hard time with that, or possibly had a hard time with that, because he makes certain assumptions about you. Right? First of all, he assumes you're a college student, and he assumes probably you're a grad student, right? So if you're reading this text at age 15 or 16, right? In some cases, he may assume you're 6, 7, 8 years older than a person who would read his text. I guarantee you, Peter Rabinowitz never dreamed a high school student would be reading it. So right away, you are not the authorial reader, probably, according to Rabinowitz. Now, you could be the authorial reader, right? You are an academic, right? You're an intellect. So you do bring intellectual rigor to this text, as difficult as it may be. You're studying English, right? You're studying literature. You're studying the act of reading. You're studying hermeneutics. You're studying the act of interpretation. So there are many ways in which you are an authorial reader, right? But there are some ways in which you're probably not. All right. And as readers, we try to hold on to those things that'll help us access a text, right? And those things are sort of those aspects of the authorial reader that the writer assumes we have, right? So, for example, as you read Rabinowitz, you may be holding on to prior knowledge, right, of what we've talked about in this class. All right. So, just to review, the authorial reader is the reader that the author imagined when they wrote. Okay, and that goes for painter imagined when they painted, playwright imagined when they wrote, painter, pardon me, I just said painter. Composer assumed would hear their work. Graffiti artist assumed would see their work, right? That kind of thing. All right, so we'll say author, but it's any creator. So the actual reader, and this actually is hopefully the easier concept to grasp, but this is the reader who actually reads an author's book. All right. The actual reader may not share the same worldview or social assumptions of the author, though they might. Actual readers may have, in theory, a more difficult time accessing a text because they do not share the worldview of the author. Okay, or I should say, if they do not share the worldview of the author. Okay, so for example, you are always the actual reader, right? Because you are actually reading a text. All right, so you can be an actual reader, right? Who also can be an authorial one, meaning you can be an actual reader who does understand the text, who can appreciate the text in the way the author had possibly intended, right? So actual reader is simple. You're actually reading the book, right? So if someone's reading it, they are automatically called the actual reader, all right? But again, the problem is that some actual readers don't become authorial ones. They don't have the necessary social or cultural understandings to make sense of the book, right? And so what you experience when you read a book or any text or see a film or see a painting, but when you read a book, right, some of the problems you may have is that you're the actual reader who's not the authorial one. You don't have something important that you need to understand the text. So, for example, if you've never read a postmodern novel, right, you're going to have a difficult time accessing it until you understand the rules, right, or the breaking of rules because it's postmodern. If you've never read a graphic novel, right, you may struggle with, do I read the text first or I look at the pictures first, right, until you understand how that graphic novel is put together. We've talked about this in class. Look at contemporary art. All right, there are plenty of people who saw plenty of paintings by Raphael and Leonardo, Mary Cassatt, and whatnot. But when they got to modern art, when they got to Duchamp and his toilet, right, they had no idea what to do with it, right? So they were an actual reader who were not authorial ones. They did not understand. They didn't have the worldview that Duchamp had that made that make sense. They knew what a toilet was, right? They knew what a pedestal was. So they did share some of what Duchamp was getting at, but the context got lost on them. All right. So an actual reader is the one actually reading a text. They may or may not be the authorial one. So let's get some examples. Let's just talk about this. All right. And I sort of went over this. You can be both. All right. Sometimes you can be an authorial reader and an actual one at the same time. Luckily, those worlds can collide. If you share the worldview of the author, you are both. Right? If you make yourself an authorial reader, you are both. So, for example, if you read a book about baseball and have no idea what the game is, you can do research and find out. Right? You would then be an actual reader who was also an authorial one. You can make yourself an authorial reader by doing some research, by asking questions, by getting help. All right. You may not totally become one, but you'll become enough of an authorial reader to get through the text. Right? That's like when you raise your hand in class and ask a question. You're trying to become an authorial reader. You're trying to understand what the author, what assumptions the author was making, and that you can also understand them. Right? So, for example, if the author assumed you knew what baseball was and you don't know what baseball is, but you raise your hand and ask Mr. Travisano, what is baseball? And he explains it to you, you're attempting to become the authorial reader. All right? So you can be both. And actually, any class in school is asking you to be both. Right? We don't just let you sort of drop a book because you're not the authorial reader. We assume you will become that authorial reader by looking at vocab, by doing some background work on the author, and that sort of thing. All right? Now, let's look at some examples. For example, this image coming up is a crucifixion scene by El Greco, and you actually have seen a painting by El Greco. You saw his view of Toledo. All right? So this crucifixion scene assumes a lot. Right? El Greco is making some assumptions when he painted this, right? He made an assumption that you knew who Christ was, right? He made an assumption that you knew what the crucifixion was, all right? He made an assumption that you knew that the sign that's placed up above the cross reads, "This is the King of the Jews," right? Because when Christ was brought before the Roman authorities, right, he was asked this question, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Right? And Christ gave one of his famous sort of non-answers, right, to that question. So El Greco assumes a lot. El Greco makes certain cultural assumptions. Now, if you view this and you go, "Oh, I know what that is. That's a crucifixion," you're an authorial reader, right? Because you have confirmed the assumption that El Greco had of you, right? When he painted this, he had you in mind. he had in mind someone who would understand pictorially what the crucifixion was. Now, he was also painting for a largely Christian audience, so he probably assumed you were a Christian. Now, I'm not going to have you go out and convert to Christianity to become the authorial reader, right? So know that some of the assumptions that a writer or a painter makes about you, you can't alter. I mean, you could if you wanted to, but it'd be a bit drastic. But you understand enough. The assumptions that he has of you that you can follow are enough. You understand who Christ was. You understand who the crucifixion was. Okay, but this is an example again of El Greco, of an artist making certain assumptions about his authorial reader. Right. In this case, if they understand who Christ was, and they may be a Christian. All right. Another example is this is a cover of Ebony magazine from 1969. All right, and this was an article published about the notion that Christ is funny. If we go back to El Greco's version of Christ for a moment, you notice that he looks pretty darn white. Now, of course, part of the whiteness is because he is dead in this picture, so there's a certain ashenness to him. But most depictions of Christ in Western art are make Christ out to be like he's from Sweden, right, or from Iceland. Okay. Historically, we know that Christ was a historical figure. He probably did not look like this, right? And so there was a lot of speculation or not even speculation, attempts to correct that idea that Christ had to be Scandinavian, even though he was from Galilee, and most people from Galilee have at least olive skin, if not darker, right? So Ebony magazine published an article with sort of talking about this notion that why can't Christ be depicted more accurately? Right. In this case, Ebony goes so far as to paint him as sort of the average black man, right? And so what this magazine's assuming, okay, so here it gets back to our assumptions, is that you know who Christ was, right? So the authorial reader is someone who understands who Christ was, right? Now the authorial reader here is also someone who has an understanding of the complexities of race in America. Right, because this Ebony magazine is an American magazine, and they are addressing sort of a pernicious racial stereotype, right, and that is that Christ had to be white. So again, sometimes these assumptions, these things that you have to understand to become the authorial reader, can be more direct or can be more subtle. Right? The direct assumption is you know who Christ was. The more subtle assumption is that you are aware of sort of the thorny issues that come with race in America. And we very much have a context for that now, given how much has happened in the past year with awareness around sort of racial divides and sort of racial attempts at reconciliation and understanding of that sort of post-Ferguson. Right? So again, if you're an authorial reader of this text, of this image, you have to the painter, or pardon me, the illustrator made some assumptions about you, and you either conform to them or you don't, right? And or you can sort of try to conform to them by doing some research. So this is interesting chap. He is the Icelandic writer Halldór Laxness. All right, and he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he's an author not very widely read outside of Iceland. All right, I happen to have read one of his books. He's actually a quite delightful and charming writer. But one of the things that makes his books challenging is that it's said that he writes from a very Icelandic, sort of larger Scandinavian point of view, and there's a type of humor in Scandinavia and in Iceland that doesn't necessarily translate well outside of Scandinavia. All right. So as I read his book, which is called Under the Glacier, which is again very charming and kind of quirky, as I was reading it, I knew that I was not his authorial audience. I wasn't understanding some of the quirky sort of humor or sort of humorous nuances of this book. I had to read. I had to read a critic who helped me understand the book, right, and get some of that sort of Icelandic / Scandinavian humor. Right, so I tried to become the authorial audience. I tried to do some research, right, but it didn't ultimately. I'm not Icelandic, right? I did not grow up in that context. So the humor of that nation that Laxness puts into his book, I'm not going to understand, right? So this is the case of I'm the actual reader who is not going to become the authorial one, right? I'll understand the book. I'll understand the plot, right? I'll understand the characterization, right? Although it's had to be translated for me. right? So in that case, I'm definitely not the authorial audience. But I'm going to have a harder time with this book, right? So I'm not as nearly as authorial as an audience for this one, for this book, as I might be for a book written by an American, right? And especially humor. Humor is very difficult to translate across cultures, right? So you'll find that you will less likely be an authorial reader when it comes to humor, right? 'Cause again, it's more difficult for an actual reader who is not from that culture to become an authorial one when it comes to humor, because humor is famously difficult to translate. All right. So sometimes an authorial audience can actually be quite different from the author. The assumptions that an author can make about an audience is that they're different than they are. So this is a still photograph from the original Broadway production of A Raisin in the Sun by the American playwright Lorraine Hansberry. This play premiered in the early 50s, and Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote it directly for Broadway, knew that the audience for this play was going to be largely white. So here's a play that one of the first plays to seriously treat the African American experience in this country, and with a almost with a all black cast except for one character who is not black but who has a mostly incidental role in it, the white character whose role is not that big. So it's very focused on a black family in Chicago, but she was writing it for a white audience. She knew that the first audiences for this play were going to be white. Eventually, black audiences did come to see this play, this play was credited with bringing black audiences to Broadway because frankly they were excluded from Broadway. The plays that were being done about the African American experience before Lorraine Hansberry were largely insulting, largely minstrel shows, and that sort of thing. There were certainly black musicals and black plays on Broadway, but they were few and far between by comparison. So again, Hansberry writes this play knowing that the opening night audience was going to be white, right? And even just mathematically speaking, at the time and still today, blacks make up a minority of the population. So just mathematically, she knew that her audiences were going to be largely non-African American. So in this case, the authorial audience, right, is going to be different from the playwright. So she wrote the play actually knowing that people who did not share her worldview, did not share her cultural assumptions, would be viewing this play, right? In fact, one of the reasons why she wrote this play, right, was to address an audience who was different from her as a way of explaining to them, showing them, making them empathetic toward the black experience in this country. So not every author thinks about themselves or their culture when they write a text, right? Sometimes they're writing a text knowing that people different from them are going to be viewing it or reading it, right? So in this case, on that opening night on Broadway in the early 1950s, the actual audience, right, was purposely given a text that they were going to have a hard time understanding or dealing with. And the job of the play was to get them by the end to become the authorial audience by educating them, right? By educating these white audiences who were used to seeing blacks in a much less humanistic way, right? So that by the end of the play, Lorraine Hansberry shows, a culture different from herself, right? Now, of course, they shared being American, right? They shared being urban, right? But there was certainly a big difference between Lorraine Hansberry's culture and the largely white culture that came and saw this play, right? So sometimes the authorial audience is when the writer thinks about their audience, this authorial audience, she knows it's going to be different from her, right? She knows very well that she's writing for someone who does not share her cultural assumptions. So lastly, we're just going to sort of mess all this up, right, with this last image. And you should recognize this image to some degree. If not the living room, then you should recognize the painting that the owner of this living room decided to decorate their house with, right? In the background, on that wall, is J.M.W. Turner's painting of Napoleon, right? War, the Exile, and the Rock Limpet. All right. And so I'm going to leave you actually with this image, right? And I want you to use this image as an exercise in discussing the authorial and actual reader, or in this case, we could say the viewer. Just know that viewer, reader, listener, it's all the same thing. All right. So I am going to ask you to discuss this image, right? Using these terms authorial and actual reader. Just, pardon me, just as you did with the Hannibal painting, right? J.M.W. Turner's painting of the snowstorm, Hannibal crossing the Alps, right? But this one, we add in the sort of the factor of where this painting is located, right? So when you're looking at, when you're looking at the Hannibal painting, you were looking at it decontextualized, right, in a book or on the website. Here, this painting is actually contextualized, but in a much weirder and different way. All right. So I want you to consider, how does this image, right, speak to authorial versus actual audiences.